Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and the correct pronunciation of the word bildungsroman. At a cornered table by the fire are two people. One of them never met a word she couldn't mispronounce, and that's me, Evangeline Denmark. And welcome to the Believe to See podcast, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. I confess I'm a fan of the bildungsroman, or bildungsroman, which what I thought it was pronounced until about 30 minutes ago. A bildungsroman is a novel of education. It follows a main character's journey of discovery or growth. And we tend to think of these particularly as coming-of-age stories, though I suppose they could be, any age. But as an author of young adult fiction myself, I'm partial to a coming-of-age story with teenage characters. And I have the feeling our guest is as well. I'm excited to welcome KB Hoyle to the podcast. KB is a fellow YA author, and I'm excited that you're here. Tell us a little about yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be on the podcast today. These days, I feel like I'm not so sure what to say about myself. I've published so many books by this point that I feel like I'm at this weird stage in my publishing career where it feels a little tiresome to talk about all the books that I've published. But I have been an author for a long time. I've been an author since about 2009, and my career has had a lot of ups and downs. I love writing for teenagers. I love that in-between stage of reading and writing, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot on the podcast today. I am the author of, I always get a little kind of stumble over this because I guess it's 14 books now for teens. And I am also the founder of Owl's Nest Publishers, which is a publishing house that the co-founder, I should say, of Owl's Nest Publishers, which is a publishing house that focuses particularly, we specialize in particularly for books that capture the imagination of adolescents in particular. So this is an area that is my love, and I'm really making the focus of my career moving forward for the rest of my life, I hope. So that's a little bit about me.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think I could spend the rest of my life with teenagers as well. I love teenagers, and a lot of people don't get that.
Right.
They look at you like you're crazy, and I'm like, no, I would have, had 10 of them in my house if I could have. But yeah, I kept trying to adopt my kids, friends. But you mentioned that in-between stage, which is like, my brain kind of just lit up because I love anything to do with in-between, liminal spaces, the threshold. And I think I never really quite thought it out, but I think that's one of the things that attracts me to writing for teens and to stories about young adults and those, coming of age stories. There's so much potential, so much excitement, so many things that could happen. Is that something that, kind of gets you going, like that kind of what if question for you?
Yeah, well, and as I've talked a lot about over the years also is that teenagers also have a lot of hope. And my co-founder at Owl's Nest, we have talked a lot about the fact that, and this was kind of a founding principle for us at Owl's Nest, is that we just don't believe that teenagers fundamentally change. So the culture changes, the situations that teenagers are put into changes, the I mean, specifically looking at how the culture changes rapidly, and people look and they say, "Oh my goodness, teenagers are so different today than they were when we were young." No, they really aren't. Teenagers fundamentally do not change. Young people do not change, and these years are so formative and so important. Who these young people are will is fundamentally the same, decade to decade, from 1,000 years ago until now. And it's funny too, because the category of teenager really didn't exist until the modern era. I mean, I don't even think it's truly even 100 years old yet. The category of, oh, this is a teenager. It really is kind of a privilege of the modern era that we even have this thing that we call teenager, because pre-industrial era, you would have had your youth, your childhood years, and then you would have gone straight to work. And but it doesn't change the fact that these teen years are formative, and are formative in ways that they're morally formative. They're formative in the moral imagination. And when I think back about how I was changed during my teen years, the big imaginations and the big hopes and the big dreams, and how my teen years formed me as an adult, and how I know that is the same for people everywhere. I just can't help but think these are years that we really need to, not to use kind of cliched language, but we really need to pour into people, because you don't get them back.
Mm-hmm.
And once teens go to college, once people go to college, so much about their life is already formed.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we give up on people, right? But so much about your life is already formed by the time you get to college. So, especially when we're talking about books, right? So when you think about the books that really formed you and really changed you, and the books that really just moved you, you tend to think back to the books that you read as a kid. That's true, but also as a teenager.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I think of, our listeners hear me talk about it like ad nauseum, but of course Jane Eyre was my favorite. And yeah, that book formed my character and formed my outlook of the world. And I can't even emphasize enough how much Jane is like with me. The character of Jane is with me, and even Charlotte Bronte. And, as I learned more about her. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And I loved what you said about hope. That's something I love about teen readers and just teens in general, is that hope and that desire for justice as well. And, people think, and they, you hear it said, oh, teenagers are jaded. And I kind of wonder if that was my generation, what they were saying about my generation, or, if that, because you were saying teenagers have kind of always been the same. So now I'm wondering, were they filled with hope even in the Industrial Revolution? I know I had hope, even though my generation would have been labeled, jaded and critical or whatever. And then this generation, I look at this generation and they are like almost unabashedly hopeful. They don't, I don't see a lot of that jaded mentality, at least, in the ones that I am around a lot. What do you think? Do you think that this generation is, that they kind of don't hide their hope? I mean, that's what I see.
I think so, because I think it's just a part of being a teenager. I think because they don't have the life experience. So teens will, I mean, it's true, right? I mean, teens will drive you crazy because they're not, I mean, sorry to any teenagers listening to this, they're not wise. Because they don't have the life experience to be wise yet. Yeah. And that's just, they may say things that kind of pretend at being wise, or they not pretend at being wise. They may say things that are wise just because they are copying things that are written or said by wiser people, right? Mm-hmm. So they can be wise in that they are I don't know what better word than copying right now. They're imitating wiser people that have gone before them. But teenagers in and of themselves don't yet have that innate wisdom because they don't have the life experience yet. But that is also what gives them a greater sort of hopefulness and a kind of go-get-emness and a, well, we're just going to throw ourselves after this thing because they literally don't know better.
Yeah.
Their brains are not fully formed enough yet. It's just then there's a science to that, right? They don't yet have the worldliness that adults have. They don't yet have a jaded sense of, well, I've tried this before, so I know that it's not going to work. They kind of, they get into a lot of trouble. They'll drive you crazy. They, because adults, and again, and I have teenagers, and I was a teacher of teenagers for 10 years. Like, when you're dealing with them, you're like, you're driving me nuts, and I just want to sit on you for a while, and I'm really mad at you, but also you can't help but admire how much they love with their whole heart and that they hope with their whole heart. And I do still see that in today's generation. They tend to be the most go-getters, and that they just don't know better is the thing, because they're caught in the in-between of being, they're not yet adults, but they're older than kids, and that's probably the most obvious thing I'll say. Hopefully the most obvious thing I'll say on the podcast today is that it just defining what a teenager is. And now from time immemorial, in the Middle Ages when life expectancy was shorter, of course, this definition of what a teenager is would have shifted because people were having kids younger and etc. But I do still think that, one of my favorite movies is Newsies. So when you said, in the industrial age, what would have, would this still have applied? I don't know how accurate Newsies is, but, look at who, at least according to the movie, look at who propelled, the newsboys strike forward. It was the youngsters. It was the kids. It was the teenagers. It wasn't, the old dusty people sitting up in their offices. So of course, those are the sorts of movies that put stars in my eyes when I was a teenager. Was watching people change the world. And I wanted to change the world when I was a teenager. And then moving forward into being an adult was, well, how do I then, write stories and publish stories that reflect these same sorts of ideals back onto teenagers?
Yeah, in a way, it's a huge privilege to get to speak into that time of life and to, as a parent or teacher, get to shepherd kids through that time. One of the things that's hardest, I think, is, seeing those moments where they encounter just roadblocks, or they, the real world breaks in. Not that they're not aware of the real world. They very much are, especially in, our digital age, and, they know everything, it seems. But that's very different than when it breaks into their world, when they reach a limitation or they reach, something that cannot be fixed or whatever. And, I've talked with mine, and, when we hit these moments, and I don't know how much of it gets through, but, I talk about, those are the moments when we recognize that things are not perfect and we long for, for the mending of the world. But I think that's particularly hard to grasp. And I remember being that age, and that concept is just very far off at the moment. Like, you're aware of injustice now, and you're aware of your life circumstances now, and you want them to be fixed now. And so you're right, that like propels revolution, for good or for bad. It does, which is fantastic. But it is a responsibility, I think. And like I said, a privilege. What do you hope that your readers find when they come to your stories? And, I don't think that people have to come out with a lesson. I'm not saying, the takeaway is you should forgive those who, I don't mean that. I mean, like, is there a theme Is there, just something that you hope touches them or affects them into the future as you're getting to write into this, very specific time when they're so full of hope and potential?
Well, because I do think that teenagers are more in the moment and kind of struggle to see the big picture, or at least to apply the big picture to, oh, this is forever. We're dealing with forever here. I always want my teenage readers to find big truths in my stories. I never want my stories to be didactic. I think that's a major flaw of a lot of Christian storytelling. And I think it's a really big turnoff, especially for young readers. They can smell that a mile away. So I never want my stories to be didactic. And I want them to come to my stories and find big truths and truths that, while the truth is there, I want my stories to be applicable to things that they're going through in their real lives. So that applicability, J.R. Tolkien, of course, used to talk about, applicability in his stories. And so I want, and you can achieve that if you're writing to big truths, big themes, big truths. And if you avoid that didacticism, like, oh, this is the lesson of the stories, boys and girls, and if it doesn't come across like young listeners wouldn't understand this, but like a Friday afternoon special, like a sitcom Friday afternoon special. So if you avoid that in your storytelling, then I think that your readers will come into it, and no matter what the story is about, they should be able to find some applicability within those big truths to whatever it is that they're going through. And I always, in all of my stories, I try to emphasize that at the end of all things will be made new. That this is not all there is. All things will be made new, that there will be a renewal. So I'm a big fan of having that eucatastrophe at the end. You don't really come to my stories to have a sad story. Spoiler alert for all my stories. I don't like tragedies, so you don't really come to my stories to have a sad story. I like the eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. If you're not familiar with that term, I want the story to point to. All my stories to point to this grand ultimate truth that all things will be made new. So.
I love that. As you can tell, I'm a little fascinated, obsessed with kingdom coming and renewal and everything that you were talking about, and I think that is the way that we kind of combat that jadedness that comes with getting older, as is inevitable.
Yeah.
So are you as an author? You said you've written a lot of books, and I've seen some of your catalog and got to read one. But you as an author and as a publisher, do you follow trends? What do you look for, you personally, in the next story that you're going to write, or the next author? I don't know how many people you publish but what are you looking for? How do you make that decision? Are you looking at the overall, what's popular, or are you more looking, like you said, does it tell this kind of story of hope?
Those are a lot of big questions. So
Sorry.
I'm going to kind of separate. No, it's good. It's good. I'm going to kind of separate them out a little bit, because what I do personally as an author, of course, I don't hold that to what I'm expecting out of the authors that we're currently publishing at Owl's Nest. And then what we're looking for from authors that are submitting to Owl's Nest that is different as well. So, what I do, I don't really follow. I don't follow industry trends. as a writer. I tried to do that for a long time. Well, not a long time. For several years when I was querying agents, and when I did have an agent for a while, for almost 3 years, and when I was with my agent, we were on. Once you have an agent, then you go on what's called submission, and so you're shopping around a manuscript to the publishing houses, and then you are trying to be on trend with what they're looking for, because publishing is a business, and why wouldn't you try to sell? You have to try and sell what you have. And that was really difficult. And I kept getting. I didn't make it on submission. I kept getting rebuffed and getting messages from the my agent kept was submitting my manuscript. This manuscript, by the way, is the one that is currently available at Owl's Nest, which is called Son of the Deep. It had a different title when it was with my agent and we were trying to sell it. And it was a different manuscript too. I ended up revising it. But we kept getting the message from editors, acquisitions editors with the big 5 traditional New York houses, and they would say, "Oh, we love her writing. She can, it's great, but I just don't like her voice," or "This isn't right for me right now," or "It's not edgy enough. It's not different enough. It's not XYZ." And after a couple years of that, I just started to feel like, well, I mean, you never really know why you fail on submission, but it really did start to feel to me like, well, maybe I'm, if it's not different enough, it's not edgy enough, maybe the YA industry, the young adult industry, is really not conducive to what I'm doing. I'm trying to write books for real teenagers. But if you go out there and if you look at what YA is publishing, it's really not. I mean, I'm speaking in generalities, so I don't want, you'll always get the person who's like, well, my daughter loves reading YA. Well, great for your daughter. If you look at what YA is doing in the publishing industry, it's really not something that I decided I really wanted to be a part of.
Yeah.
And I realized that trends going all the way back to the publication of Twilight, which Twilight really was, we could have a long discussion about publishing trends. But if you go back to when trends started to change for YA, it really goes back to the publication of Twilight. And I realized that the YA industry was really pushing books that were written more for adult women, and in content and style and price point and size and all sorts of things. And I thought, I don't want to write books for adult women. I want to write books for teenagers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my books were clearly not, as far as the trends were concerned, my books were clearly not doing it. I ended up parting ways with my agent in early 2020 and reevaluating my career. And I mean, I knew I wanted to be an author, but I just thought, where is there a space for me? Because in traditional publishing, with the big New York houses, there really isn't a space. And again, speaking in generalities, there really isn't a space for people like me who really want to write books for teenagers. There's not a lot of books being published for ages 13 to 15 or 13 to 16.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of books being published that are really reflecting true teenage voice. And so that's when I started to consider, well, maybe we just form our own publishing house. And so me and my best friend, Katie Stewart, we formed Owl's Nest. And so as far as, I basically I write and publish what I've had a long list of books that I've wanted to write and publish for a long time that have been on the back burner, because since I'm talking 2015, 2016, that have just been I'm just waiting to publish them because I had the agent. And publishing is a slow moving machine. And I wasn't getting anywhere in traditional publishing. And it's not a matter of not being good enough. I got an agent. That's like, I mean, it's going to sound very braggadocious of me, but
it's hard. No, it's hard to get anything.
It's very difficult to do that.
Yeah. I know.
I knew it was good enough. I was getting in front of the eyes of acquisitions editors in New York City, but it was just a matter of not connecting with trends.
Yeah.
the current trends and what YA was doing. So over at Owl's Nest, we actually don't say that we publish YA at all because YA is a very specific thing.
Yeah.
And people expect very specific content, which is very edgy and it's very, it's filled with a lot of things that we don't necessarily want to put in our books. So we say we publish teen literature.
Okay.
We publish middle grade literature. And books that are submitted to us, we don't care about marketing trends. We don't care if zombie literature is hot right now. We don't care if, time travel literature is hot right now. We just say that people who submit to us, they have to have manuscripts that sound like true, authentic adolescent literature, that it really reflects a true adolescent voice. And we also don't say that we're a Christian publishing house, because we'll accept manuscripts from anybody. It just has to be true, beautiful, and good. And in the manuscript and have that true, authentic adolescent voice. So as far as paying attention to marketing trends, no. I mean, of course, we want our books to sell, but those are the things that are important to us. So that's the longish, shortish answer. We could have a whole podcast series on that.
Yes, and I'm like right there with you in so many of those experiences. It is exhausting chasing the trends, and it's silly in my opinion because they always say they want the next thing. Or if you're chasing the trend, then you're not going to be the next thing, obviously. So lots of double standards or, just confusion. So I've been in the industry for a while, was out of it for a while and now writing again. And I'm just like less and less interested in the traditional way of going about things and just interested in writing books, because that's who we are as writers, and all the rest of it, I'm sure, well, I guess you guys probably have a marketing department or whatever, but you know how hard it is for writers to split themselves in between the creative process and the marketing process. It'll just kill your soul.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you know a great deal of this, right? I mean, and you know how hard it is to stay on top of any trend. Well, and then the goofy part of it is so you have trends, but then you try to write to a trend, but it takes
years.
2 to 4 years to produce a book. So then that trend is really a trend that's going to be a trend how many years down the road, or will it be? I don't know.
Who knows? Yeah. No, write the story that, is given to you. And I think that's all we can do and, take the next step. Well, let's talk about your books because I had to choose. I couldn't read all of them in a matter of weeks. The one that you mentioned, the Deep, what was that one called again? The
Son of the Deep.
Son of the Deep. That was like my second choice. I almost read that one because the premise was really fascinating. So I want you to talk about that. And then I want you to talk about the one that I did read because I loved it. So let's go into fairy tale retellings. I'm a fairy tale junkie. I love fairy tales. So Son of the Deep is a fairy tale retelling. Can you just give a little hook, give a little information about it?
Yeah, so Son of the Deep is a gender-flipped retelling of The Little Mermaid. So instead of it being a mermaid, it's a merprince, and it's instead of a prince on the land, it's a princess, and she very quickly becomes a queen, though. So that gender flip is something I did when I was with my agent because we were in an attempt to make it more different. Ended up rewriting the whole book when I was with him, but it is a true to Hans Christian Andersen retelling of The Little Mermaid, except that it has a happily ever after.
I was going to say, that doesn't fit with your Eucharistic.
I know. Except that if you read Hans Christian Andersen, if you read the original fairy tale, you will come to realize a close reading of that. It's an amazing reaching for heaven sort of spiritual story where you have this mermaid. Of course, mine is a Mer Prince character, but that is longing not really so much for a romantic relationship, but for a sort of reaching for a spiritual sort of awakening, like reaching for the skies. And that made me think of Till We Have Faces, and sort of this longing for the mountain and longing for the God of the mountain. And so there's a lot of inspiration there for me. There was a lot of inspiration from Till We Have Faces when I wrote Son of the Deep. So although, and I don't remember if it was Lewis himself who said this, that every fairy tale actually goes back to Psyche, the tale of Psyche, and so that got me thinking about that. But I tend to think of that too. I'm kind of a closet Platonist because of C.S. Lewis, so you can find strains of the tale of Psyche and Platonism in basically all my stories too. But so it is a retelling of Little Mermaid, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. I'm not doing a very good job of giving you a,
no, that was fantastic.
Elevator hook of this story.
Now I'm like, okay, this will be next on my list because I adore Till We Have Faces. And I have not revisited, the Hans Christian Andersen Little Mermaid. Of course, I'm familiar, but I haven't revisited it. But I'm going to reread that through that lens. And now I'm so excited to go back and look at that. So I'm so glad you talked about it in the way that you did, because it was just like, ding, ding, ding. Okay. I have to read. I've reread Till We Have Faces a couple of times. It might be time for a reread again. It's one of the ones that I go back to.
It's just so beautiful. I mean, it can be reread a million times. And my fairy tale collection of stories, so I'm working on the next one in the fairy tale collection right now, is a universe of stories where they can each be read in any order. They're all going to be retellings of classic fairy tales, where I take the basic fairy tale and just kind of spread it out and make it a novel. They're all dual perspective, where you go from one chapter is one character, the next chapter is the other character, but only two characters. I don't like to head hop too much in my stories. And that they all kind of have this thread running through them of longing for where their romance is, yes, but the point of the romance is really to show this longing for something else. I mean, a good romance should show this longing for,
it should,
like what I was talking about earlier, a reconciliation, a making of all things new, which is and the kind of. Now I'm going to lose the phrase, but a good romance could kind of show the renewal of all things, the bringing together of the reconciliation of kind of male and female, and how that kind of points to a new world,
Yeah, I agree.
I can't think of the words that I want right now, but
it's always when you have to talk that you can't think of the words. Yeah. I'm very familiar. Yeah. No, I mean,
resolution of contraries. That's what I'm trying to say. A good romance should have the happy ending is a resolution of contraries, which points to the resolution, the making of all things new, at the end, in the new heavens and the new earth. That's what a good romance does.
Yeah, one of the things that I love in looking at fairy tales, especially the really old ones like Beauty and the Beast, is what is that underneath subconscious longing going on in these stories that have lasted through oral storytelling, in multiple forms, multiple cultures with the same core story. And, we've, in some ways there's been, modern criticism that, I can understand where they're coming from, talking about, like the roles of women and men and all those things. Those things should be examined. But I think when you look deeply at these stories, you're seeing, mankind going, we're in need of rescue, and that's kind of at the heart of so many fairy tales and even just the little trickles of myth that we get down through the ages. If you look at it through that lens, rather than, through kind of a postmodern breakdown that's so,
Right.
so jaded and so without, kind of the Christian imagination, or without depth, or without just an understanding of that, is what has driven stories and has driven, humankind. That longing for
Right.
redemption, that longing for rescue. I forget where he's going with this, but anyway, I was saying I think you see that if you're looking for it. And so I think retellings are especially rich when we're able to kind of plumb that subconscious.
Right. Well, and the beauty of fairy tales too is that we have the opportunity to retell them over and over and over again. So we can re-examine some of these questions. And the heart of the story can stay the same. And the heart of those longings can stay the same and whatnot. And if you want to soften, if you want to kind of fix some of those things that are a little uncomfortable for a modern audience, that's fine. You can do that. There's no rule against that. These are public domain stories. Go for it. The successful retellings will last. The unsuccessful ones will fade away. And then a new generation will come up and they'll do it again. I mean, how many retellings of Cinderella have we had in the last 10 years even? So, there's no law, again, there's no rule book, there's no law against retelling these stories over and over and over again. And just the fact that people want to continue retelling them just proves the point that they are classic stories with big truths in them that pull at the heart of what makes us human, what makes us spiritual beings, what makes us long for the other.
100%. We're getting a little low on time, but we have to talk about the Queen of Ebenezer. I just fell in love with that story. Just your setting, your world building, your atmosphere. I just loved it.
Thank you.
Just briefly, I know we're almost out of time, but tell me a little bit about creating that world and just how you went about that. I know I read I think it's in the back. It talked about how you there was a swamp called Ebenezer.
Yeah.
Which is just...
Yeah, there is one.
There's a swamp called Ebenezer is like the most interesting thing in the world to me. Like, someone had a swamp.
Yeah.
They named it Ebenezer for reasons.
Yeah, well, and I lived in Alabama for 14 years, which I know you can't hear in my accent at all. I could turn the accent on if you wanted me to, but I won't. Ebenezer Swamp. So it wouldn't be strange to you at all if you were in the Deep South.
Okay.
Lots of things are named Ebenezer. It's a very common church name, graveyard name, and this little swamp is it's right on the edge of a graveyard, and there's a little church nearby too. And there's lots of things that are in the story are true to the location. Like there's a tiny little kind of prefab house, and then across the street there's this big, not like a mansion or anything, but like a big white kind of wealthy farmhouse and farmyards and horse pasture and whatnot. And this Ebenezer Swamp is about a mile from my house, so I would go. So when the pandemic struck and lockdown struck, this was a location that I would go because it was a little nature walk, and it was only, I don't know, half a mile of kind of trails, and there was a raised little pathway, and it was just an easy place that I could actually go during lockdown to be quite frank, to get away from my kids and, be stuck in the house with the kids all day, go over to Ebenezer and walk and just kind of have some time. And the swamp was also, there are these statues, these kind of artist installations in the swamp of there's a giant dragonfly and there's a giant crane, which if you read the book, you'll understand that. There's also a giant frog, which I didn't end up putting in the book. But, and several years ago, I received a painting as a gift from someone at an art fair that was an owl. It's on my wall here. I don't know. I know this is a podcast, so people can't hear it. But it's on my wall, and I'm a little bit afraid of moving my laptop and screwing up the recording, but there it is. No, it's not over there. It's over there. I don't know if you can see it. There's the painting back there. And that is an owl with many eyes. And the local artist this was in Montevallo, Alabama, she said that she was inspired by Montevallo Swamp to paint that owl, and that it was for the fairy tale or the nursery rhyme for the owl that sat in the tree, and the more she saw, the less she spoke, and that's how she became a wise little owl. The little nursery rhyme. And I got that back in 2017, and also in 2017, one of my very, very, very close friends died of brain cancer, and that was when I first started walking. We moved to Montevallo. I started walking Ebenezer Swamp. And then, of course, as I said, too, I walked it a lot during the pandemic. And it became kind of a liminal space for me. You go into the swamp, and true swampland, by the way, I know I'm kind of rambling on here, but true swampland really only makes up something like, someone's going to fact check me on this, but I don't care. True swampland only makes up something like 3% of the United States of America. And this is a tiny little swamp in Alabama that was a mile from my house, is one of the most, not anymore, I live in Wisconsin now, but was one of the most important ecological spots in the country. And it was just really, I would go there, and there were signs up all about how important it was. Tiny little swamp. Birds, you'd see birds there that you wouldn't see anywhere else, migrating down from Canada, and it was like their stop before they went on to South America. And you would go into this swamp, and a hush would just fall over you. And it was a green space, and it was forests have always meant a lot to me. And I've always been kind of a Christian mystic, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Oh, you are in good company.
I know, yeah. I've had these spaces, and I have a 6-book fantasy series called The Gateway Chronicles, and it is written entirely set in my other thin space, which is in Upper Michigan, which was another kind of spiritual forest for me. And so I've always kind of been moved by spiritual forests. And this is what Ebenezer Swamp was for me. It became a spiritual refuge for me after my friend died. And during the pandemic, it was a space for me just to go and meditate on God and on my place in the world. And it was kind of an in-between between, just that hush, like a very real hush that falls over you. And what's really interesting about swamps, a lot of people don't know this. You expect to go into a swamp. You think, oh, the bugs are going to be all over me. There are no bugs in a swamp. The bugs disappear because there are so many birds. And so they eat all the bugs. And so it's real buggy in the forest right outside the swamp. And you step into the swamp, and it's just like a hush, like a blanket falls over you. And all you can hear are the birds and the frogs, and you hear these weird knocks. Knock, 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 knock.
Yeah.
Knock, knock, knock. And it's the woodpeckers.
Okay.
But it was always, because I'm a fantasy writer, it just always kind of piqued my imagination. And around 2017, in 2017 was the first time I started to build this story in my mind. What if Ebenezer, what if I set a story here? What if Ebenezer was a literal middle space? And again, I don't want to say too much, because it's sort of story, you can't really say too much, or you're going to ruin it. But what if it was a sort of middle space? And I'd never really tried my hand at light fantasy before. I tend to write more detailed magical systems, or I've written science fiction too, this detailed systems, and everything has rules and explanations. I thought this would be the perfect space where Ebenezer itself could be almost a character in the story.
Yes.
And so that's how it all came to be. I held the story in my head from 2017 all the way until I had time to write it. And, my agent wasn't interested in the story, so I never wrote it when I was with him. I saved it until Owl's Nest, and I wrote it in January of last year. I sat down and it took about 6 weeks and just knocked it out.
Wow. I have a burning desire to go to a swamp now, which is not something that I ever thought that I would say. But
They're magical.
I too love thin spaces. We did a podcast actually earlier this year on thin spaces. One of my favorite concepts. I too love, forests as well for the same reason. And so, what I would say about that book is that you accomplished in pages the creation of a thin space, which is fantastic, which is phenomenal. I mean, that's something. But it really does, beauty just kind of breaks through in that story. And, the sadness is there. The, need for renewal is also there. And, as a reader, at least I certainly felt it. But that just made the beauty of that place that you described just all the more rich. So thank you for that book. And thank you for being on our podcast. Tell our listeners where they can find you, where they can find KB.
Well, you can find me on my website, which is kbhoyle.com, although I will admit that I woefully neglect my website these days because I do so much over at owlsnestpublishers.com. So check both places. I do try to keep up with my website as much as possible, but owlsnestpublishers.com is where all of my new books are being published. So my backlist books, which we didn't even get into this, but that was all, I was with a previous publisher and then they went out of business. So I had to re-release all my old books on my own. So my old books are over there. I've got 10 books published and information about my old books over at kbhoyle.com. But owlsnestpublishers.com is the publishing house that I co-run, and we have a great staff over there. And if you're a writer and you're thinking, I'm really interested in what you're doing, check us out. If you're a reader and you're really interested in what we're doing, please go check us out. Check out what we're publishing. We have great books, great authors, several authors that we're publishing, lots of exciting things coming up. Go sign up for our newsletter and check out the books that we have available for sale.
Fantastic. Thank you again so much for being on the podcast. Things are winding down.
Thank you for having me.
At the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have 30 or so seconds to spare right now, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.